Today's daf is Tzadi Gimel, actually, but we're going to start at Tzadi Bet, bottom of the page, Amud Bet, bottom of the page, new Mishnah. It's a short Mishnah, where we left off yesterday. Hamotzi kikar l'rshut rabim chayav. If a person brings a loaf of bread into the public domain from the private domain, chayav, he is liable for the violation of Shabbat. That is not really a chidush, is it? One should already know that. However, the chidush is hotziu shenayim peturin. If two people carry the loaf of bread, which obviously doesn't necessitate two people, so then they are each exempt. Lo yachol echad hotziu v'hotziu shenayim. What if this is an enormous loaf of bread, so large indeed that one person alone can't possibly carry it? We can envision such a large loaf of bread. In that case, then so in a case where the two people are necessary to make the action happen, in other words, when you have a case where either person by themselves really could have done it, but they did it together, so then they're each exempt. And Rashi gives actually two explanations in two different places for why this exemption occurs. One possibility he gives is local, sort of, to Hilchot Shabbat, because he says that it's like a shinui, it's like doing something in an unusual way. Because if there's something that you can carry that you could carry alone, you wouldn't typically carry it with somebody else. So that's an explanation that's only relevant in Hilchot Shabbat, because in Hilchot Shabbat we have the idea that you have to do something in the normal way, and if you do it with a shinui, by doing it unusually, it's an exemption. It's not Masekhet Shabbat. It's not the typical way of doing it. That's one way of looking at it. The Rashi brings another explanation of Rashi, which is more generic. It's a broader and more universal explanation, and therefore can be applied to other areas of halacha as well, is that it's impossible to identify the responsible party. When two people do something that each one alone would be capable of doing, and they do it in conjunction with one another, it's impossible to say A did it or B did it. And therefore, since the liability can't really be assigned to one party or the other, and we know that this was a one-man action, we end up in a position where we can't hold either party responsible. So anyway, and that would apply to in a broader context. So we're going to see several different situations to which the Gemara is going to apply the same logic here. However, Rabbi Shimon poter, even in a case where neither person alone could carry this loaf of bread or this item is so heavy that it requires two people. So the Chachamim said if it requires two people, then each person is indispensable to the action. Each person is responsible for the action, because since they couldn't have done it alone, neither person could have done it alone, that means that they're both responsible. But Rabbi Shimon says that even in such a case where they both are indispensable, neither one is going to be liable, because according to Rabbi Shimon, it's a gezerat hakatuv, as we're going to see. It is a given axiom that only one person can be liable. In other words, that only an action done by one person can create liability on Shabbat, even if the two people were both absolutely necessary. Still, only one person can become liable for one action on Shabbat, and an action done by two people is automatically an exemption, according to Rabbi Shimon. We're going to see more in the Gemara. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, V'amrei la Amar Abaye. And some say it was Abaye that said it. V'amrei la, and some say b'mat nitatan, it came from a Tosefta. Zeh yachol v'zeh yachol, if both parties were capable of carrying the item, such as in a case where it's just a loaf of bread. So Rabbi Meir mechayev. Rabbi Meir says, even so, if you did it together, each person is liable. So Rabbi Meir's view is a view that didn't appear in our Mishnah. We now have three views. We have the view that says that if two people participate in an activity and they share the activity, even if either one could have done it alone, they're both liable. And then you have the view of Rabbi Shimon, which is the other extreme, that if two people do an activity, even if neither one could have done it on their own, neither one is liable. And then you have the middle position of Rabbi Yehuda. As we're going to see that it's Rabbi Yehuda. It was the Tanakh Kama in our Mishnah. It's going to be Rabbi Yehuda. That says that if neither person alone could have done it, so they're both liable because they were both necessary. If either person alone could have done it, so then neither one was really necessary, And the liability becomes diluted between the two of them, and no one individual is going to be held responsible. So you have these three views. So Rabbi Meir is the most stringent. He says even if two people carry out a loaf of bread that either one could have carried alone, they're still both liable. And then we have Rabbi Shimon Potrim. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon Potrim. And in such a case where both individuals, either one on their own, could have carried the item by himself, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda both are exempt the people in that case. Okay, Rabbi Shimon exempts because even if they were both necessary, he would exempt, and Rabbi Yehuda exempts because in this case they're both capable of doing it alone. Let's say a case where neither could have done it alone, so they needed each other. It's so heavy that they needed each other. So Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir mechayavim. In this case, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir agree. Rabbi Meir agrees because he doesn't even care. He says anytime two people do a malacha on Shabbat, they're both liable, even if each one alone could have done it. So certainly when they're necessary, when each one is necessary, because neither one could have done it alone, certainly in that case you're going to be liable. And Rabbi Yehuda holds you responsible because he says at the very least, in a case where the item is too heavy for one person to carry alone, where the two people are necessary, you're going to be liable.
Can I just, one clarification. What's discussed here is what constitutes a shinui when it comes to carrying one object with two people, right? Not is it really shinui or is it another...
It's hard because according to the first way that Rashi interprets it on this Amud, for example, at the top, where it sounds like almost he's saying that the reason why there's an exemption in the case where two people carry a loaf of bread is because it's not the normal way of doing it.
Right.
But that's difficult to say because that would mean that Rabbi Meir doesn't care about that.
Right.
So it's an easier way of learning what he says later more explicitly, which is that it's a general principle that one violation per person. And we're going to see how they learn that out from a... They're going to learn that out.
Because of Shinui, in other words, what exempts...
Not because of a Shinui. Not because of Shinui, but because of the dilution of responsibility, basically. Right. Yeah. That's an easier way to learn it. As we're going to see, it's much easier to learn that way because otherwise you're going to have to explain why Rabbi Meir is going to hold them responsible.
Right.
Okay. So in that case where it's so heavy that you need both people to do the action, so then Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir mechayvim, Rabbi Shimon poter, and Rabbi Shimon is still going to exempt you because Rabbi Shimon says that you're never liable if two people are involved. And then finally, if one person is capable of doing it because he's very strong, and the other person is not capable of doing it because he's weak. Okay, so let's say Mr. Arnold Schwarzenegger is bringing this item outside and he could carry it on his own. And then some wimpy guy comes and he carries it with him. So really Arnold Schwarzenegger could have carried it on his own. But this other guy's assisting him a little bit. He's taking some of the weight off, but he couldn't have carried it himself. So in that case, definitely the person who's capable of carrying it is liable because he didn't need the other guy at all. He was totally self-sufficient. And the other guy couldn't have done it on his own. So we're going to see the Gemara is going to explain this more clearly later. But Tanya Nami Hachi, we also learned in a Braita, if you take out a loaf of bread by yourself to the Reshut HaRabim, to the public domain, you are liable. Hotziu Shenayim. If two people brought it out, Rabbi Meir Machayev, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Im lo yachol echad lotzio v'hotziu Shenayim chayavin v'im lav piturin. Rabbi Shimon poter. So basically you have a restatement of the same three positions. According to Rabbi Meir, in all cases, if two people carry an item, they're both chayav, they are both liable. According to Rabbi Shimon, in all cases, if two people carry an item, they are both exempt. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, it depends. If either one alone could have done it, and they just decided to carry it together, they're exempt. If neither one could have done it alone, and they needed each other, so it was a combined effort to make it happen, so they're both liable because each one is indispensable to the activity. The activity is a two-person activity. It's not a one-person activity.
The hardest to understand is Rabbi Yehuda because it's like when two cannot carry either one alone, it's like each one's doing a half a malacha.
Right. I guess that's the argument of Rabbi Shimon. He's going to say in any case, you're splitting it in half. Rabbi Yehuda is saying that there's certain malachot there's certain activities that require two people. So by their nature they require two people. So that's different. Yeah. So that's different than a malacha that by its nature requires only one person, but you decided to do it with two people. So that's how he's interpreting it. So now we're
Are we talking the whole piece of furniture? What
let's say a heavy table or something, heavy item. Right. They carried it out. So but this would apply really to any malacha that two people do that requires only one person. They're just using the example of, we're going to see, let's say two people hold the pen and write. It would be the same.
I mean, that's also subjective because one can take also a heavy object, but it's much easier to do it with two people because
it's easier, but you're capable of doing it alone.
So you might be capable of
Right. Well, that's like the case of Arnold Schwarzenegger carrying the table. It's a little bit easier for him that the small guy is helping him, but that doesn't mean that he's necessary. So, where are they getting this from? The Tanu Rabbanan, as we learned, the rabbis taught ba'asotah. It says when it talks about korban chatat, when it talks about liability for violating prohibitions that would normally be karet, they would normally be the very severe penalty of karet, but when they're done by accident, you have to bring a korban chatat, and it says ba'asotah, achat mikol mitzvot Hashem. When a soul does one of these things that it's not supposed to do. So ha'oseh et kula, it says ba'asotah, which is short for ba'asot ota. In doing it. In other words, you have to be responsible for the entirety of the thing. Ba'asot ota. It. You have to be. So that's what it means. Ha'oset kula. The one who did all of it. Ha'oset miktzata. Not the one who did part of it. In other words, if you only did part of it, you're not completely liable. Ketzad, what's the case? Shenayim shayu ochazin malgez, which should be probably mazleg, we would call it, right? But it got switched around velogzin. Two people are holding a pitchfork. And they are piling up grain on Shabbat. So Rashi says it means forka. Forka is like mazleg, we would call it, right? So they are gathering grain. Gathering grain is the malacha of me'amer, gathering together what's in the fields. So two people are doing it together. Or becharker v'shovtin, or they are holding a stick together and fixing the threads on the loom, which is another malacha. B'kulmus v'kotvin, or they're both holding a pen and writing together. Bakaneh, or they're both holding a stick v'hotziu l'reshut harabim, and they carry it into the public domain. Yachol yu chayavin. You might say, well, look, in the final analysis, they did a malacha. They both participated, and we like joint participation, bipartisan activity. So why don't we hold them both responsible? So it says no. Talmud Lamar ba'asotah. In doing it, which means one has to be the cause of the entire thing and not just part of it. We turn to Tzadi Gimel Amud Aleph. Let's say you had a large they would have these cakes of figs or dates that they would make, these large things. So they were too heavy to be able to carry them alone. So they would, and two people carried it, or a large board.
Confuse yesterday between gargoret and devela.
Right, devela is the pressed figs into like a pressed figs. So bakora, or they had a large piece of lumber and they carried it.
Not a lot of figs into the.
They're pressed together into a string. They're pressed together like into one big thing, igul in a circle. So or a korah, or you had a large board, and it required two people. So there, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, if one person alone couldn't carry it, and it requires two people, and the two people carried it out, then they would be chayavin. Each one would be liable because they are necessary for the action. If, on the other hand, it could have been pulled off by only one person and two people did it, piturin, they're exempt. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, no, I disagree, Rabbi Yehuda. Even though this board is so heavy that it required two people, and so therefore two people carried it out, still I say they're exempt. Why? Because it says in the Torah, ba'asotah, yachid she'asa chayav, shenayim she'asu piturin, that one person must do the thing. Ba'asotah, he must be responsible for the entire action, and not shenayim she'asu, not two people doing the activity. So therefore Rabbi Shimon would basically say that there are certain activities that you can never be liable for on Shabbat, because they can only be done jointly. Okay, that would be the implication. But how are they understanding the pasuk? Obviously, both of them are, or all three of them, are dealing with the same pasuk. Because it says if one soul should sin accidentally from the people of the land, in doing it, meaning in doing one of these bad things. So that's the pasuk. That's not the complete pasuk, but that's the fragment they're going to focus on. Rabbi Shimon says, there are actually 3 exemptions here. One is to tell you that if you split a melacha into 2 parts, for example, you pick up an item in the Reshut HaYachid and the other person puts it down in the Reshut HaRabim, like the very first Mishnah in Masekhet Shabbat. The individual inside picks up the item and somebody else puts it down, that's exemption number 1. And the other exemption that's learned out from this pasuk is when both people are equally capable of doing the activity alone and they decide to do it together. And the third exemption derived from this pasuk is that even when neither person could do it alone and they needed each other to do it, they're still exempt. That's how Rabbi Shimon interprets the pasuk, because it says nefesh and it has the word achat and it has ba'asota. So you have 3 things that emphasize singularity in the pasuk. Okay, 3 things that emphasize that the individual has to be responsible alone for the activity. Nefesh, achat, and ba'asota. These 3 things.
But then according to that, you can do anything on Shabbat as long as you have 2 people.
You're right. It would always be. Well, it would be rabbinically prohibited still. But yeah, he would say that that's like that would be a rabbinic prohibition. Rabbi Yehuda. How does Rabbi Yehuda understand it? I agree with you on the first one, and I agree with you on the second one. That the first exemption of nefesh is to tell you that if one person does first half of the malacha and the other one does the second half, like one person picks up an item in the private domain and one person puts it down in the public domain, that they're exempt. And I agree with you on the second derivation, that achat teaches you that if they're both capable, in other words, if each one could have done it alone and they did it together, that they're exempt. However, I disagree with the third one. But the third one that you're saying is coming to teach you, ba'asota is coming to teach you, that if the 2 people couldn't have done it alone, in other words, person A couldn't have done it alone and person B couldn't have done it alone, they could only do it together, you're saying that even there they are exempt. Rabbi Yehuda says, I disagree. The third exemption is not in that case, because that case actually you're liable for. The case that's exempted is when a yachid does it behora'at bedin, that the bedin declared or ruled that a certain activity is permitted on Shabbat, mistakenly, and I went and relying on that ruling of the bedin, I did this activity, and then it turned out that they made a mistake. So even in that case, Rabbi Yehuda says, even though you did the entire thing yourself, since you were relying on somebody else, it didn't really come from you because it wasn't your mistake. So this is another way in which it's not your responsibility. It could not be your responsibility because you shared the activity, or because you did one half and the other person did the other half, or it could not be your responsibility because you're relying on the psikat halacha of the Bedin. The Bedin ruled that this activity was permitted. They made the mistake. I went out and did it. Why is that my fault? So therefore Rabbi Yehuda says you're exempt in that case. So Rabbi Shimon, Yachid Borat Betin Chayav. Rabbi Shimon says in Masekhet Horayot, which one day God willing will reach, that if a person does something, the individual who acts based on the psikat hadin of the Bedin, even though it was erroneous, and even though he was relying on the Bet Din, he's still responsible. Okay? If the entire community goes out and does it according to the ruling of the Bet Din, there it's communal. But where the individual transgresses, even though he was relying on the erroneous ruling of the Bet Din, he's still held responsible. That's Rabbi Shimon's position. Now we don't follow that, but that's what Rabbi Shimon says.
That's harsh.
Yeah, it's harsh. So therefore he doesn't have that third exclusion that Rabbi Yehuda does. So Rabbi Yehuda uses the third exclusion to exclude the person who's relying on the Bet Din's ruling. Rabbi Shimon says, I don't believe in that exemption, so my exemption is that even in a case where 2 people do something where either one couldn't have done it alone and they do it together, still they're exempt. What about Rabbi Meir? Does it really say 3 different exemptions here? No. All it says is nefesh achat and ba'asota. There are not 3 things. Nefesh is one, achat is one, ba'asota is one. There's no such thing. So you can't really interpret it as 3 different exemptions, but 2 exemptions. Nefesh achad techeta and ba'asota, that's it. So what are the 2 exemptions? One is to exempt a case where you only did half the melacha. For example, you picked up in the private domain and somebody else put it down in the public domain. So you didn't do the whole melacha. Or alternatively, where you did your melacha based on the mistaken ruling of the Bet Din HaGadol, where Rabbi Meir agrees you would be exempt. Okay? So what you find here is, what does he not have? He doesn't have any exemption for a case where you did the entire melacha and the other person did the entire melacha and you did it jointly. He doesn't have any exemption for that, Rabbi Meir. So this is how each one of the 3 schools bases its position on this verse, how to interpret the exclusions or the exemptions in this verse.
It could easily be, just reading the Mishnah, it could also be interpreted that one started it and the other one finished.
Right, but that's definitely not it. Each one has to have done the entire thing together.
Right.
Had to, because we know that from the earlier in the Masechet. Because we know that from the very first Mishnah.
Because just reading this Mishnah in a vacuum, you could interpret.
You might have thought that, right? You might have thought that, right? Shinaim shasua, right? You might have thought that that's what it means, but really, it's presuming that each one did the entire thing, because otherwise you would have the Mishnah, the first Mishnah of the Masechet, where the one guy picks it up inside and the other guy puts it down outside. Then that would be a liability, right. But it's not. Even according to Rabbi Meir, that would not be. So Amar Mar, the master said, if one is capable and one is not capable, so everybody agrees that he is liable. So if Arnold Schwarzenegger carries it and Mr. Wimpy carries it along with him, the Arnold Schwarzenegger is going to be liable. So which one is going to be liable? Obviously the one who's capable of carrying it. Because the person who's assisting him isn't doing anything. Right? It's like the guy who says, I loosened it for you. The weak guy who says, twist the thing and says, here, I loosened it for you. That's why you were able to do it, right? It's not true. It could be true sometimes, but Amar le Rav Amnuna. Rav Amnuna says, what about the fact that he's assisting? Amar le misayeh in bo mamash. He said to him, you know what? Rav Chizda said, misayeh, the person who assists, if he's not necessary, he's just loosening it for you, so to speak, but really not doing anything, that person is nothing. He doesn't count. His involvement doesn't count. Amar Rav Zavid, Mishmei de Rava. Rav Zavid said that in the name of Rava, we learned a similar case. Yoshev al gabe amita. This is talking about a zav who sits on something. There's something called tumat moshav of a zav. If a zav sits on a bed or anything else which is designated for sitting, or he sleeps on something, so anything that supports his weight, even if he's not directly touching it, even if he sleeps on 10 pillows, the bottom pillow will become tameh, equally tameh, because this type of tum'ah is anything that supports his weight. So let's say he sleeps on a bed, varbat aliyot tachat raglei amita temeot she'ena yechola la'amod al shalosh, that under each one, now obviously this person lives in a very messy house, and so there's a blanket under each one of the legs of the bed. Okay, and he's on the bed. Now we want to know which one of the blankets is going to be tameh. The answer is all of them, because you can't have a 3-legged bed. So each one of the 4 legs is supporting the zav, and therefore whatever's under each one of the 4 legs is also supporting the zav.
That goes.
Yeah, the talitot are under the bed. So in other words, the bed for sure is tameh. But the question is, underneath each one of the legs is also a towel or a blanket or whatever. So, or a talit, whatever it is, a garment. So this garment, it could be any kind of garment. So these garments that are under there, the question is all 4 legs are equally tameh? So the answer is yes, because all 4 legs are equally necessary.
That goes only in the house, right? Like if someone is in his house and he is a zav, it doesn't mean that in China somebody is getting... No,
yeah. Well, the person in China is not really supporting, holding him up. Although financially, China's holding us up. Financially, they're holding us up, but not physically. So, but anything under you, like this chair, let's say under this chair is a pillow or something like that, so that would also be. So for Rabbi Shimon mitaher, and Rabbi Shimon is consistent with his position, because remember, Rabbi Shimon says even if the things are indispensable, whenever there's shared causality, shared support means nobody's liable. It's like a corporation. According to Rabbi Shimon, it's kind of like a corporation. In other words, whenever you have a joint effort, you lose your individual identity. So the individual legs don't have an identity here. It's one collaborative effort where each individual loses their identity, like a team effort, and therefore none of the legs are liable. Yes, the bed is tamei, but we're not going to say, oh, this leg contributed, it was essential, and that leg is essential, so therefore the garment under leg number 1 is going to be tamei, and the garment under leg number 2 is going to be tamei. However, raglei behemat tehorot, when it comes to an animal's legs, even the chachamim are going to agree that if there's a talit under the feet of the animal, so it's going to be tehorot because since no one leg is indispensable, because the animal can actually stand on 3 legs. Because if you walk, a person can stand on 1 leg and an animal can stand on 3 legs. You don't need to have all 4 legs planted on the ground. You don't need to have both of your legs planted on the ground as a person, as a biped, to be able to stand up. So therefore, we can't say that the talit that is under the feet of the animal is going to be is going to become tamei. Because in that case, we can't say that each of the 4 legs is indispensable to standing up. Now, v'amai, why is that so? Hakam misayeh bahadeh hadadeh. Even though it's true that the lav mishum the amrinan misayeh in bo mamash. So the Gemara says, even though it's true that the animal uses all 4 legs, obviously the animal's happy to have 4 legs, all 4 legs help. Still, since out of the 4, there's always at least one at any given time that's not indispensable. So we wouldn't say that we don't care about the fact that it's misayeh, that it helps the animal to stand up by having 4 legs. The fact is that having 4 legs is not indispensable. So if you were to have, let's say, under only one of the feet of the animal, a talit, for sure we would say that we cannot say that leg was indispensable. So the zav is riding along on the animal. A living animal cannot become tamei, by the way. But what's under it could become tamei. So there's a talit under the foot of your horse. You're a zav. You're riding along. You can't say that talit is going to be tamei that's under the foot of the animal, because that foot is not indispensable to the standing of the animal, and therefore it's not indispensable to your support. Okay, so but now Amar Rav Yehuda midiskarta, but Rav Yehuda from diskarta said, "Le'olam emalach misayeh yesh bo mamash." I'm going to argue against you and say, you know what? It's not true. Anything that contributes to an effort is significant, even if it's not indispensable. V'shaneh hacha de'akra la legamrei v'kevan dezimnin akra ha v'zimnin. Oh, so I'm sorry, but that's the next part. So he says that the fact is that it's contributing to the support of the zav, but it's not. Even though it's not indispensable, it's still contributing. The reason why we don't consider that foot of the animal to be a support of the zav is because the animal lifts up its leg. In other words, the animal actually lifts up its leg off the ground. It's literally not always standing on its leg. And therefore, since it's not always standing on its leg at any given time, let's say it's walking around, so we can't look at that leg as contributing to the support of the zav, because it lifts up a leg and it lifts up the other leg. Okay, so now the Gemara says, but wait a second. The kevan de zimnin akraha v'zimnin akraha, it's not like it lifts up one leg and it just stands there on 3 legs. It lifts up one and then it lifts up the other, like when it's walking. So, lehevek zava mitapech. Then it should be like the zav that rolls around in bed. Milo tanan did we not learn in the Mishnah zav shaya mutalal chamisha safsalin? If you have 5 benches laid out and the zav is lying down on them. Oh, al hey pundaot, or there are 5 pundaot belts, or these are kind of soft belts that sometimes they would lie down on. So and he's lying down on them. Lo orkan temeim. If he sleeps to the length of them, in other words, if he sleeps along the length of one of these belts or one of these benches, then certainly it's going to become tamei. Why? Because if you're sleeping on the length of the bench, imagine the bench over there, that means that the bench is supporting your entire weight. So if you roll over to the second one, now it's supporting your entire weight. You roll over to the third one, now it's supporting your entire weight. It's not shared. However, so that's tameim lerochban teorin. But if you had 5 benches and across the width of the benches, you were lying across the width of the benches instead of across the length, so no one bench is really supporting your weight. We can't say that it's supporting the majority of your weight, because actually you're supported by all 5 of them, because you're across all 5 of them, the width of all 5 of them. So yashan, but if you went to sleep, safek mitapech alehen tmein. But if he goes to sleep, then we don't know, because he might say, yeah, I went to sleep, and when I was sleeping across the width of the bed. But maybe he was, maybe he moved around. So maybe at a certain point, bed number 1 was actually holding the majority of his weight, and then bed number 2, then bed number 3, 4, and 5. So bench number 3, 4, and 5. So we don't really know. So since he was sleeping, we can't be sure. Okay, so similarly here, the horse or whatever is moving its legs and lifting one and lifting the other. At any given time, we can't really say which one is supporting, which one isn't supporting. So therefore, we have to assume that all of these legs that have talitot under them are going to be, the talit under is going to be tameh, because because at any given time the animal is moving around, just like the zav is moving around, and one way or another, at some moment, we have to presume that one of these legs was indispensable to supporting the zav, and therefore the thing under it is indispensable. But
it sounds like that's irrelevant, because the act can only be performed when at least 2 legs are, because if it's only 1 leg, you're not carrying anything, you're just standing.
Right.
So you can't.
True, but supporting. It's about supporting.
Is it just supporting?
It's supporting. Yeah. So ela lav mishum damrin al misayeh in b'mamash.
Let's say you own a giant racetrack, privately owned, and it's a fence.
Right. That's another issue. That's true. That's another issue.
There's also a question.
Right.
Is there a chazaka for tuma and tahara? If something was a talus is known to be tahara, that you have to actually know that it was tameh.
Right. So here you're raising a really, really good point, which is that the Mefarshim go into here, which is why is it. And Tosafot even mentions Vafila b'reshut rabim tameh that it's stronger. Normally, a safek tuma b'reshut yachid is tahor. I'm sorry, is tameh, and the safek tuma and reshut rabim is going to be that's when it's going to be tahor. Right? That's a general principle. So here, it's such a likelihood. Tosafot is saying
principle too.
That's true. But apparently, in a case like this of sleeping, people are presumed to have moved around all over, and therefore we have to presume them all tameh. But it's true. Generally, a safek tuma in a public domain would be tahor. And in a private domain would be tameh. That's true.
No, private domain is
tameh.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a general principle. But so what do you see here, though? But you definitely see that misayeh in bomamash. Why? Because when he's lying across all 5 of the benches, and none of them is fully supporting his weight, they're all helping. Right. So in that case, what do we say? We said that they're tahor, because no one is real, even though they're all contributing. Right. No one has the majority of his weight. And the contribution that each one is making is considered negligible to the total. So that's what we can conclude from there. So in the same way, these legs might be shifting their weight from one to the other, but at the end of the day, they're all just contributing to the total, and therefore we don't consider any one of them to be the absolute supporter of the zaf. Not because one lifts up off the ground and the other one lifts up off the ground, but because they all are doing a collaborative effort where no one leg is really identified as the essential one, because they're all sharing the burden, and none has the majority. So Amar Rav Papi Mishmei de Rava. Rav Papi said in the name of Rava, Af Anan Nami Tanena. We also learned in a Mishnah that Rabbi Yosei Omer, Asus mitameh al yadav, hachamor al raglav. If you're riding a horse and under the front legs, you're a zav riding a horse, and under the front legs of the horse is a talit, so then that would be tameh. If you're riding a donkey and on the back legs al raglav, okay, under the back legs is a talit, then it would be tameh. What's the reason? Shemishenet hasus al yadav v'chamor al raglav, because the horse leans on its front legs and the donkey leans on its back legs. But what do you see from this? That even in other words, the point that Rabbi Yossi is making is that the horse, the majority of its weight is pressed on the front of its body, and so therefore, even though the back of its body is also helping, any talit under the back legs would not be tameh. And the reverse is true with a donkey, that the back legs are where the majority of the weight is placed, so therefore anything under the front legs is going to be tahor. And what do you see from this? But don't the front legs still help? Don't the back legs still help? Lav mishum damrin an misayeh in bamash. Rather, we see that even though you have 4 legs here, and all 4 are contributing, the fact is that the majority of the weight is placed on the front 2 or the back 2, and therefore we don't care about the one that's just just contributing. Amar Rav Asher says, Af anana mitanena, we also learned in a Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Raglo achat al hakeli, v'raglo achat al ritzpa. If a Kohen is standing with one foot on a vessel and one foot on the floor of the Beit HaMikdash, Raglo achat al even, v'raglo achat al ritzpa, he's standing with one foot on a rock and one foot on the floor. Ro'in kol kshi'ilu yinatel hakeli v'tinatel even, yachol la'amod al raglo achat, avodato keshera, v'im lav avodato pesula. Now it's necessary for the Kohen to be standing in the Beit HaMikdash in order to do the avodah, and he has to be fully situated in the Beit HaMikdash in order to do it. So that means if one of his feet is resting on this other item, then we have to ask the question, if he could stand on one leg, if we were to take that rock away from his other leg, or we were to take the vessel away from his other leg, he's still standing firmly enough that the one leg that's planted in the Beit HaMikdash would hold him up, so then any avodah he did in that position would be good. But if by taking away if he's leaning so much on the rock, or leaning so much on that other vessel that if we were to take it away he would collapse, he wouldn't be standing on the one foot that's situated in the Beit HaMikdash, then he's not considered to be standing in the Beit HaMikdash. Okay? So now the Gemara says again, but wouldn't you say that even though it's true that it's not indispensable, the rock he's standing on with his other leg is not indispensable? If you removed it, he would be standing up straight, right? So isn't it still helping though to support him, that rock? It's still helping him. He's using it. That's why one of his feet is on it. And yet, what do we say? We say that it doesn't matter. Lav mishum damrinan misayeh in bomamash. Rather, we say that support, contribution to support, is not significant. Amar Ravina says, kibel biyamin usmol misayato. If you received something with your right hand, but your left hand is helping. In other words, the Kohen has to do his avodah with the right hand, but he uses his left hand to help. Avodato kishera. His service is still kasher because he mainly did it with his right hand. What about the fact that the left hand is assisting? Therefore, you see from all these cases that in a situation where you have two contributing causes, but one would exist on its own, and the second one is just adding something, but isn't indispensable. And if you remove the second one, the first one would be just as good. Okay, it wouldn't be just as good, but it would be sufficient. So if the Kohen is standing with one leg in the Beit HaMikdash and one leg propped up on something, but he's standing enough on that leg that's in the Beit HaMikdash that if you were to take away the extra support he's getting from that item, he would still be able to stand. So that's the case of Misayeh. Or if he's able to do the avodah with his right hand, but he supports it a little bit with his left hand, so yeah, it's making it a little bit easier. But the left hand is not indispensable. The right hand could do it alone, so therefore the left hand is not posel, it's not going to invalidate the avodah done with the right hand. Amar Mar, the master said, Zayechol v'Zayechol. We said that according to Rabbi Meir Mechayev, in a case where both of them are contributing, and even though by themselves they could have done it, both of them are contributing, that Rabbi Meir still holds them responsible. Okay, that he's the most stringent opinion. So Tosafot wonders why we're using the example of Zayachol v'Zayachol, where both are capable of doing the action and they do it together. Why don't we ask this question according to Rabbi Yehuda, and in a situation where neither one could do it alone? And in fact, there were some Girsaot that had that version as well. But the main point is we're talking about jointly done activity. So Ibailu, they asked a question about Inan Shi'ur Lazeh v'Shi'ur Lazeh, Odil Mash'ur Echad L'Kulam. So how do we understand this idea of joint activity is basically what the Gemara is asking. Do we say, literally what the Gemara says is there one measurement for each, or each one has to have his own measurement? In other words, let's say the minimum amount of carrying an item is a fig's worth. Does that mean if two people carry it out, does that mean there has to be 2 figs worth? Or does that mean that you need to have just 1 fig's worth and the two of them are sharing it? Okay? So according to So basically the question is, when we talk about a joint activity, is it one activity shared by 2 people? Or is it 2 activities occurring together? So therefore you need a minimum measurement for both. So now Rav Chisda v'Rav Hamnuna chad amar shiur lezev shiur lezev chad amar shiur echad lechudan. One view, Rav Chisda and Rav Hamnuna had a machloket. One said that you need a minimum amount for both, and one said you're going to need a minimum amount for the action, not for each participant. Amar Rav Papa Mishmei de Rava. Rav Papa said in the name of Rava. Af anana mitanina. We learned this already in a Mishnah. Haya yoshev al gabe mita v'arbat haliyot tachat arba raglei mita temeot mipnei she'en yichola la'amod al shalosh. So we go back to the Mishnah we learned before. The Zav is sleeping on a bed, or he's sitting on a bed rather. So the 4 legs each leg has a talit under it. And since each leg is indispensable to holding up the zav, therefore each talit under each leg of the bed is also going to be tameh. Ve'amai, why is that? How could it lav mishum damrin and shiur echad lechulan? Obviously, you have only one measurement for everyone, because what is the measurement of supporting? The measurement of supporting is it must support the majority of the zav's weight. The majority of the zav's weight. Now, how many zavim are there?
One.
Only one. So in order to have a majority of the zav's weight for each of the 4 legs of the bed, you would need 4 zavim. And be able to say that, leg 1 is shared. Each one would have to have a minimum measure for itself. So that would mean you would need 4 zavim. But you don't. You only have 1 zav. So that shows you that the activity is one activity of support, shared by the 4 legs. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak brings another proof. We also learned if a deer comes into your house on Shabbat. Okay? This could happen around here. You never know. So a deer comes into your house on Shabbat and you close the door in front of it. Chayav. You just trapped the deer. What if 2 people close the door together? Piturim, because they did the malacha of trapping, but they did it together. What if the door is so heavy, you have a really heavy stone door, it requires 2 people to close it, and you closed it together, so then what would you say? Chayavim, because you closed the door. And it was each participant was indispensable to closing the door. And you trapped the animal. Why don't we require that each person have a deer? In other words, it has to be that 2 deer came in. Because the measurement for trapping is 1 living thing, right? So if each one has to be doing their own melacha when they do it together, there has to be a measurement of accomplishment for each one. You would need 2 deer to come into the house for 2 people to be liable. So therefore, what do we see from that? That it's only 1 action shared by the 2 people. Okay? Lav mishum de amrinan shiur echad lechulam. Amar Ravina says, we also learned that if 2 partners steal, now there's a halacha that there's a mitzvah in the Torah that says, it's not a mitzvah, it's a lotas, meaning it's a negative commandment, that if a person were to steal and slaughter or sell an animal, either they slaughter it or they sell it, so then they have to pay back 4 or 5, right? They have tashlumei arba'a v'chamisha. That's the famous thing. So it's so in the tashlumei arba'a v'chamisha, the paying back of the 4 or the 5. So what obligates you in that is that you stole the sheep, the ox or the sheep, right? And you slaughtered it or you sold it. So the question is, what if 2 people do it together? 2 people stole the sheep together. So since you don't have a situation, in other words, since they did it together, shouldn't you have to have a slaughtering done by person A and a slaughtering done by person B? How can they share it? If you're telling me that the action has to be divisible between the 2. It's not just that they were indispensable to what was accomplished, but it has to be divisible between the 2. So here it's not divisible between the 2. So therefore, what do you say?
You could sell 2 people could sell a sheep or...
Right, but they wouldn't be able to do tivicha. They wouldn't be able to slaughter it together, because you can only do 1 slaughtering per sheep. You would need 2 sheep. So what you see is they share the action, and it only has 1 minimum measurement. Rav Ashi says, we also learned that if 2 people bring out the stick of the weaver, which he uses to press the cloth together as he's weaving, he would push the cloth together so it sticks together. So if 2 people bring it out, Chayavin, they would be liable. So why should it be that the 2 people who are carrying it out are liable? Why shouldn't there be a minimum measurement necessary for each one? What you see is there's 1 measurement shared by the 2, and the measurement is that they're carrying out the stick together. This is according to Rabbi Meir, obviously, right? They're carrying it together, and it's 1 stick that meets the measurement. So Amar le Rav Achabre de Raval, Rav Asher, Rav Achabre, the son of Rav said to Rav Asher, Dilma it beikede levashel betzakalalazeh. Maybe it does have a minimum measurement that's shared by both. Maybe it's 2 measurements, because remember, one of the measurements of a kaneh, of a stick, is the amount of wood that it takes to cook an egg. And maybe there's enough to cook 2 eggs in this particular pan or this particular stick. There's enough to cook 2 eggs, and that's why they're both responsible. But Rav Ashi answers and he says, but if that's the case, that we're talking about 2 people that just took out an ordinary stick, why does it mention that it's the stick of the weaver? Obviously, it's trying to tell us that there's not enough in this stick to cook 2 eggs. So, but maybe there's enough in this stick to weave 2 cloths. In other words, that you could its utility is enough that you could actually use it to help in the weaving process for 2 garments, and therefore they share the measurement because it's something that they could divide between them. So therefore the Gemara says, rather we cannot derive anything from the case of carrying out the weaver's stick. However, we still have plenty of proof from the other cases that when an action is shared, there doesn't need to be a minimum measurement for each participant. There just needs to be a minimum measurement to make it a significant action, and that the action is shared between the 2 participants. So now we say Tanei Tana Kamei Rav Nachman. One of a Tana taught in front of Rav Nachman. A Tana was one of these people who would recite Mishnayot and Baraitot in front of the rabbis. So he recited the following Baraita Shenaim Shotziu Kanashil Gardi Piturin. It says that if 2 people brought out the stick of the weaver, they are exempt. Rabbi Shimon Mechayev, and Rabbi Shimon holds them responsible. Now, how's that possible? Klape Laya. That's contradictory to everything we just learned. We just learned that Rabbi Shimon is the most lenient. There's no case where Rabbi Shimon obligates 2 people who participate in a melacha, ela ema chayavin. Rather say that the Tanna Kama said chayavin, that they are responsible for carrying it out. For Rabbi Shimon poter, and Rabbi Shimon was the one who was exempting in that case. And it would seem most reasonable that we are talking here according to Rabbi Meir, because otherwise, why would or we're talking about a very heavy stick where where it requires 2 people to carry it. So either we're talking about where it requires 2 people to carry it, or we're talking about, according to the position of Rabbi Meir, that even if the 2 people could carry it, each one could carry it alone, still they are liable for carrying it together. So basically what we learned today was questions about causality in terms of action. In order to be responsible for having caused an action, when we have 2 people doing it together, what are the parameters of shared responsibility? Do we say that when the 2 people participate together, it takes on its own identity, it's a new joint action, and neither person is liable? Do we say that both people are liable if they participated in bringing about the effect, even if both of them could have done it alone? Or do we say that only when the activity is a 2-person activity that required both of them are they both held individually responsible? And then we talked about the question of, when you deal with these joint activities, is it one activity being done by 2 people, or is it 2 activities being done simultaneously? And therefore, do you need a measurement of liability for both participants, as if it were 2 activities that they're combining together? Or is it one activity, there's one measurement which they are sharing, not that they're combining 2 activities into one, but they're sharing one activity that is made significant by the measurement? And that is what the conclusion is, that you only need one measurement. You don't need enough for both of them but one measurement to render the activity significant is enough to make it considered a cause of liability on Shabbat.